everyone, and welcome to a very special Alberta edition of Go. Today we are at the Military Museums here in Calgary for the launch of a new historical educational initiative, the Spirit of Vimy. It was created by Her Honor, the Honorable Lois Mitchell, and it was inspired by the Battle of Vimy Ridge. We're going to find out more in the next few minutes about the battle, the significance it had for us as Canadians, as well as this initiative and how you can get involved.
The Battle of Vimy Ridge is such a battle that defined Canada. Those people knew that they were sacrificing their lives for what they felt was right. I think they're probably, I have to be honest with you, I didn't know that much about it. So I would assume, and I think that most people don't really know what went on and do not understand that it was really, that's where Canada became the nation.
I wish I could say that every Canadian knows a lot about what went on at Vimy Ridge. The problem is that for the last 30 years or so, Canadian history has been downplayed in the school system in most of the provinces, and the events of both world wars have been downplayed. So I think that today's Canadian high school student might ask him or herself, what's that funny thing on the back of the $20 bill? And a lot of them, when it came out, thought it was the Twin Towers in New York City that were destroyed on 9/11 in 2001. And then you have to start back and you have to say, well, let me tell you about Canada in the First World War.
I think it's very important for the youth of today to really understand what Vimy Ridge is all about and what happened, is because it really helped found Canada as a nation, and it really helps create an identity for the country on a global scale. And I think by having a richer understanding of the past, it can help you understand where you came from and what your country really looks like on a global scale. So I really think it should be implemented more into education systems and just abroad for youth, so they're more educated, and that way they're better Canadian citizens.
I thought the best thing to do is to stress the points that every Canadian should know about Vimy Ridge. And the first and most important thing is that the Canadian Army fought together for the first time in the war. We'd been sending these divisions over individually since 1914 and collecting them into the Canadian Corps, and then in late 1917 we formed them into one unit. And the important thing about that is that coming from Canada with Canadian officers, the unit began to operate almost as a national learning machine. That the lessons that were being learned by the British, by the French, by the Belgians and others on how to cope with this trench warfare, the Canadians began to pick up these lessons and distribute them amongst each other and work together to try to lay plans for how they would fight in the future. Let me give you a historical background, context to the Battle of Vimy Ridge, which was fought from Easter Monday, April 9th, 1917, and was essentially over by the evening of April 12th, 1917. And to show you a little bit about what it looked like when it started, this is Vimy Ridge here. You can see the contour lines. You can see the beginning of the main line of German resistance, because the Germans had held Vimy Ridge for, at that point, almost 3 years. The main line of resistance is this red line over here. This was one of the strong points that the Canadians had to overcome in attacking Vimy Ridge, Hill 145. This little pile of plastic was actually a hill which the Canadians nicknamed the Pimple, which created a lot of problems for the 4th Canadian Division after it began attacking up Vimy Ridge. The Canadian line is in blue, and there were a good number, several dozen it's a tunnel dug in the chalk of the surrounding countryside, through which thousands of Canadians on each attacking division front poured from rear areas into the front trenches just before the attack. And why did they come through these tunnels? Because they could not be seen by German observers on the top of the ridge, and because when they were in the tunnels, they were relatively safe from German fire or from German artillery. So there were tunnels all along here, but we're just showing you one which was called the Grange Tunnel. And then for the first time in the history of the war, all 4 Canadian infantry divisions fighting together in one battle. The color of these cones are not quite coincident with the actual colors of the divisional patches, but 1st Division located over here, 2nd Division located over here, 3rd Division over here, and the very new and tried only once before in battle, 4th Canadian Division. Okay, now Vimy Ridge itself, as you can sort of see from this map, was actually a salient or a bulge into Allied lines which had been held from the Germans, by the Germans, virtually from the fall of 1914. And you can't really see from this map, but some of these hills on top of the ridge or near the top of the ridge, or some of these ridges on the top of Vimy were from 200 to 250 meters above sea level. So from the ridge itself, one could see literally hundreds of square kilometers in all directions deep into Allied lines. It was a perfect observation point. The British and the French had tried on a number of occasions to capture the well-fortified Vimy Ridge, but had failed in each instance. In early 1917, the United Canadian Corps, and I say united because we had been sending over divisions since the fall of 1914, the 1st Canadian Division going over in the fall in October of 1914, followed by the 2nd, followed by the 3rd, followed by the 4th, forming into what was called the Canadian Corps. But for the very first time, the Corps was tasked to plan for a battle to capture Vimy Ridge by itself. And that whole battle, the Battle of Vimy Ridge, was part of a joint offensive which the British were going to launch to the north of this map. You can't see it, which is called the Battle of Arras, A-R-R-A-S, or two S's, and to the south of it, the Battle of Vimy Ridge. And so the British historians will always refer to this as Vimy Arras. In early 1917, the Canadians were given the objective to take this and began to prepare. Now, what kind of preparation did they do? And I think this is the key to understanding part of the real story of Vimy Ridge. Number one, the Canadians were fighting together for the first time. Number two, the Canadians were given the opportunity to show what they had learned, bloody lessons of how to fight trench warfare since late 1914. And they had been learning together under one commander, in this case, a British general named Byng, and they had been learning how to exchange information amongst the 4 divisions, how to learn lessons from other armies that were fighting on the Western Front, the British, the French, how to try to overcome this problem of trench warfare, deep trenches defended with machine guns and quick-firing artillery to break up any attack. And some of you who have some knowledge of the First World War will know that many of the offensives that went on up to this point had very, very high casualties and very little to gain from those attacks. Probably the most famous being the Battle of the Somme that began on July 1st, 1916 and kind of petered out in the fall. And the British gained somewhere in their neighborhood of 5 to 10 kilometers for a total of about a million casualties, almost the size of the city of Calgary being wiped out in that period of time. And so what the Canadians did was they began to prepare weeks and weeks and weeks before this battle by, in the rear areas, actually marking out a mock full-size replica of Vimy Ridge with all of the important German defensive positions marked out. And they began to train to attack the real ridge by attacking the mock-up ridge. The plans for the attack, what every company and what every battalion should be doing at a particular moment in time, were all worked out to the last detail and distributed amongst the attacking soldiers, which had not been done before. It was treating the attacking soldiers with a great deal of respect, but understanding that they needed to know what they were doing and what the larger picture was so that they could apply themselves properly when the time of battle came. The artillery, the Canadian artillery, led by a man who later would become Commander-in-Chief of the 1st Canadian Army in the Second World War, General MacNaughton, began to do two things. One, plan an artillery offensive that would pave the way for the attackers to go up the ridge, and two, spot the German artillery wherever it was, anywhere near the ridge, to take it out before the attack began so that the Canadians would not run into heavy artillery fire. The third thing the Canadians did was they amassed a tremendous amount of supplies behind the lines so that they could bring up ammunition and other necessities, food, so on, medical supplies, very, very quickly, using these chalk tunnels, as I said, that had been dug. The Canadian assault troops from the 4 divisions were fed through these tunnels into the Canadian trenches on the front line. Now, the attack itself was launched on the morning of the 9th of April, 1917. It was a rotten morning. It was very cold, snow showers, rain, very wet, and the Canadians had to get up that ridge. And aided by artillery fire and careful planning, the Canadians were able to move very quickly, much greater distances than the French and the British had been able to before them. Ian, do you want to show, for example, the 1st Division over here? Now, this is the main ridge here. So you've got a slope up. This is a slope up to essentially the top of the ridge. And they move about 6 kilometers virtually in a day, which was unheard of in the days of trench warfare. The 2nd Division right beside them, guarding their left flank, moving up a steeper portion of the ridge and ending up more or less on the top of the ridge. The 3rd Division going to a spot on the other side of the ridge itself, really at the foot of the ridge, and the 4th Division charging up a very steep slope. You can see very strict, very narrow contour lines, and ending up not quite as far. For the most part, the troops of the 1st, 2nd, 3rd, and 4th Division, well, 3rd Division, had I'm going to call it a relatively easy time. There were 3,500 Canadians killed over the 3 days of the battle. Think about that compared to, for example, the numbers of Canadians we lost in Afghanistan in a much longer period of time. These were very, very heavy losses for a country that was as small as ours was in population at the time. But the 4th Division over here ran into stiff German opposition on top of this little pile of plastic that represents what the Canadians called the Pimple. And it was a relatively long, relatively high hill that had somehow been left out of the planning, and the Germans here are taking the left flank of the 4th Canadian Division under direct fire as they advance up the hill, and when they reach their objectives, they're being shot at with rifle fire, machine guns, and so on, because it's really a very short distance, and grenades and so on and so forth. So the Battle of Vimy Ridge, although it sort of ends in the south by, I'd say, midday on the 10th of April, continues on until the 12th, with the 4th Division over here battling their way in this direction to get up this height of land and to take the Pimple and eliminate German opposition at that point. The bottom line is this: why is this considered an important battle in Canadian history? Well, one, because all of the Canadians in the Canadian Army at that time, in the Canadian Corps, fought together. Number two, it was a signal victory. Casualties were high, between killed and wounded, some 10,000 in 3.5 days, but much, much lower than other countries, the British and the French, who had tried to take it. Third is the idea that Canadians from all across Canada, from Eastern Canada, from the Maritime provinces in Atlantic Canada, through to British Columbia, all fighting together in one unit. And finally, it was a success. So it was marked in 1936 by the dedication of the Vimy Memorial on land that had been donated to Canada by the government of France. Because even by 1936, Canadians were beginning to recognize that Vimy Ridge was a signal event in the history of this country.
So, what is the spirit of a 1917 Canadian soldier? Well, what is spirit for any of us, really, right? It's not a tangible thing. It's a whole bunch of different pieces, I think, that make up the spirit of an organization or a spirit of a person. For a 1917 soldier, having a dry pair of socks in your rucksack or in your backpack, and just knowing that they're there. I might not put them on today, I might not put them on tomorrow, but they're there if I need them. That has an impact on the spirit, something as tangible and tactile as that. A book of dry matches so you can enjoy a smoke, something that in 1917 would have been worth a fraction of a penny. A little piece out of Punch magazine, which was the magazine that a lot of our soldiers enjoyed, a British humor magazine. Still in publication today, I think, sir, if I'm not mistaken, but I could be. Time to jot a note home. All of these things contribute to the spirit. Just take a second right now, all of us, what is it that drives your spirit? What is it that takes you from feeling to this? And we all have that little something. If you look inside your heart and find that thing that lifts your spirit, as a young Canadian, as a young Albertan, you'll find yourself shockingly close to the men and women of 1917. They weren't that much older than you when they went up that ridge in some cases. I just want to talk very briefly because I think Dr. Berkeson has covered this extraordinarily well, as is his fashion. But just a little bit to dote on the spirit of 1917. You know, it's you would think that by Easter of 1917 that the spirit of a Canadian soldier might be in the dumpster. Well, why do you say that? Well, this was a war that in 1914, a lot of young Canadians like you, exactly like you, were terrified that the war would be over before they could get to it. And the war did not end at Christmas 1914. It went on, and it went on, and it went on. And it became more horrible with each stanza, with each spiral of its evolution over the years. From the destruction of the old British Army in 1915 to the industrial butchery of the Battle of the Somme, as Dr. Berkeson has alluded to. Make no mistake about it, the spirit of the Somme looms large over Vimy Ridge. The new British Army, they had to recruit a new one after 1915, Kitchener's Army, Lord Kitchener. That army lost 57,407 soldiers killed in action on July 1st, one day, 1916, the opening day of the Battle of the Somme. Now, the Canadian Corps, the soldiers that you've heard about this morning, they didn't join the Somme battle until later in August, and it limped along and well into the fall. But the Canadian Army lost in excess of 24,000 soldiers, 24,000 casualties as a result of the Battle of the Somme. And I mean, for you and me, for foot soldiers in the trenches, it's cold. There's artillery going off all the time, even if there's not a big push going on. That's what they called the offensives, the big push. Going over the top required all of the moral courage that your spirit could muster. You're lousy all the time, and by that I don't mean that your wrist shot was off. You were dealing with lice in your clothing and your hair. It was perpetual, it was dirty. It was tough, tough, tough living. And when the big push did come, when we did go over the top, the amount of ground gained, not like you heard here at this landmark battle, the amount of ground gained for the amount of young men and women killed was very, very little. Through all of these stanzas, through all of these iterations, as this war evolved, the Germans held the ridge. They'd held that ridge since October 1914, as you heard a moment ago. So, what is my spirit like on Easter morning? You heard from Dr. Bergeson, it was cold. You would think it would be low, but it wasn't. It wasn't low. During the Somme, in May of 1916, we pick up a huge first down. General Julian Byng becomes the commander of the Canadian Corps. General Byng was a brilliant officer. If he were here today, he would be doing the talking. He had this ease of manner and this grace where he could look down and criticize your school, your homework assignment, your brigade or your battalion with the manner of a farmer leaning over a fence to talk about crops. He had a warm high social intelligence, a warm availability. And he was a stickler for training and detail. And the meticulous discussion that Dr. Bergeson took you through with the big model and the timing for the creeping barrage, a lot of that innovation came with his leadership. And our soldiers loved him. They called themselves Byng's Boys. He became our Governor General in 1921. I could be stood corrected there, but he was our Governor General. And when he died in 1935, he was deeply mourned by a lot of Canadian soldiers who survived this battle. Innovation was huge for Vimy Ridge, and I won't speak more about that. General Curry, who commanded the 1st Division, the red pylon over there, was a real innovator. You've heard about the creeping barrage in detail, sneaking the artillery along so the Germans are still frying eggs while our soldiers are actually on the march. Who would have thought about that? And all of these things were geared towards conserving manpower. So if I'm Corporal Conrad in 1917 and my general is all about conserving manpower, you had my admiration and undying affection at hello. So the spirit of team, of sportsmanship, of we can get this done, it was high. And the fact that we attacked together for the first time has been alluded to, that was uplifting as well. It all amounted to this enormous buoyancy for this pocket army inside the British Expeditionary Force. And that buoyancy goes to the heart of this competition. It's among us today. And I mentioned at the start of my spiel, trying to connect yourself to the men and women of 1917. It's not that hard. The spirit of Vimy Ridge, the spirit of this event in 1917 are with us all the time, not just on the back of the $20 bill, but among us as Canadians and Albertans. These men and women knew how to look at a problem that looked like it could never get done and do it. And one example, a field of Timothy alfalfa or a field of wheat. And I just drove by a bunch of them on Highway 2 yesterday. The feeling of looking at that with your scythe or whatever implement you're using to cut it and then just getting it done. There is something very Albertan and very Canadian about turning an enormous objective, and you can do that with teamwork and with spirit. We can still see today and experience the challenges and opportunities that Canada affords us and afforded them. It is here among us. We can still see them. In fact, we must see them. And you should try, I shouldn't preach to you, but I would encourage you to try and put that passion into the projects when you submit on the spirit of Vimy.
On April 13th, after 4 days of fighting, Canadian forces were able to accomplish what no other nation or regiment was able to: capture and secure Vimy Ridge for the Allies. 100 years later, you can be a part of the legacy of Vimy Ridge through the Spirit of Vimy Ridge contest, created by the History and Heroes Foundation. Sportsmanship, perseverance, integrity, resiliency, inspiration, and teamwork are the core traits that define the spirit of Vimy Ridge, the battle and the legacy it left behind. Now it's your turn to become part of history. Produce an original creative piece in the format of your choice that represents the 6 traits of the spirit of Vimy Ridge. To enter your project, visit spiritofvimy.ca and complete the submission form. Then upload your original piece. The most compelling projects will be awarded a trip to France to experience the Vimy Ridge Monument firsthand. The winners will be announced by the Lieutenant Governor in April 2017. Thousands of Canadians fought at the Battle of Vimy Ridge and throughout World War I. As the 100th anniversary of the Battle of Vimy Ridge approaches, now you can show what their courage and perseverance mean to the Canadian identity.
I think this initiative will really help the youth learn about Vimy Ridge, really because the initiative really provides an incentive for them to learn. And by having an incentive to learn, especially for teenagers, you know, it's an amazing thing. It works really nicely. And I think that this initiative will really help pave the path, or, you know, put down the footsteps to a long, prosperous future of Canada's youth learning about Vimy Ridge and understanding what really the impact it had on the nation. And this is a great way to help kind of spearhead that activity.
This initiative is certainly going to help because it's going to publicize Vimy Ridge during the 100th anniversary celebration or memorial of Vimy Ridge, and more school children in Alberta will get to know what happened, and they'll get to know, hopefully, what the involvement was of their Alberta great-grandfathers, whom they've probably never seen. And maybe that'll lead them to more curiosity about the rest of the role that we played in the First World War and the Second World War. And I don't mean that in a sense that we glorify war as an important part of Canadian existence, but neither should we ignore it as fundamental events in the formation of this country.
I think that because they're so bright today, and they're such amazing people, these youth, these 14 to 24-year-olds, I've always been in awe of all their amazing technical skills. And I think the big thing is, though, often they can research all this amazing history. This is what you want them to do. And so it's really the opportunity, I think it gives them a chance to show their great imagination.
Well, thanks so much again for joining us, to our viewers from right across Alberta, for this special edition of Go. We've had a great time. If you would like more information regarding the initiative, the Spirit of Vimy, or the Battle of Vimy Ridge, you can head online to www.thespiritofvimy.ca. Thanks again. We'll see you next time.